I still remember that night so clearly, the way the air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, the way the quiet streets of Maplewood felt like they were holding a secret. I had just finished a long shift at St. Mary's, and my whole body ached in that dull, heavy way only nurses really know. When I bent down to grab the pile of mail off the porch, I was ready for the usual bills and ads, but right there in the middle was this thick envelope with gold lettering. It looked too fancy to be mixed in with the rest, and the moment I held it, I knew it was going to change something. I walked inside, dropped my bag right on the floor, and called out that I was home. My little boy Joshua, just 7, came running out of the hallway, waving a piece of paper like it was treasure. His cheeks were pink, and he could hardly catch his breath as he told me he had drawn a dinosaur in class, and his teacher said it was his best work yet. His eyes were glowing, and for a second my exhaustion melted. I ruffled his hair, told him to show me later, and followed him toward the kitchen. Chloe, my 10-year-old, was already at the table, bent over her math homework with that little wrinkle of concentration between her brows. She's always been more serious, more focused than her brother. My husband Stephen had just come in too, loosening his tie while fiddling with the coffee machine like he couldn't settle until he had his evening cup. He looked over at me, asked casually what came in the mail, and that envelope burned in my hand like it weighed 100 pounds. I tore it open, and the words jumped out at me. Amanda is getting married. My baby sister. I froze for a second, and Stephen let out this long whistle before asking if it was Richard Thompson, the big realtor everyone in town knew by name. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. Richard was one of those men who seemed untouchable. Money, power, charm, a reputation for always getting what he wanted. I read the words again, feeling a twist inside my chest, half pride and half something I didn't want to name. My little sister, always shining, always one step ahead, now marrying a man the whole city respected. And me, standing there in my kitchen in scrubs that still smelled like antiseptic, with 2 kids needing my attention, and a husband who looked more at his phone than at me most nights. I smiled like I was happy for her, but inside I could feel that whisper starting, the one that said, "Her life is bigger than yours." The invitation said the wedding would be in 3 months, and all of us were expected to be there. I sat there at the kitchen table with that card in my hands, and suddenly I was 12 years old again, standing in my parents' living room, listening to them praise my little sister Amanda. She's 5 years younger than me, but she's always had that spark, that confidence, that way of smiling that makes everyone in the room want to lean closer. My mom, Nancy, used to look at me and sigh, saying I should try to be more like her, more alive, more everything, and I kept quiet, but inside, every word left a mark. I wasn't the bright, shiny one. I was the steady one, the serious one. I went to nursing school, married Stephen, had Joshua and Chloe, built a warm little home that smelled like laundry and grilled cheese. And yet, no matter what I did, there was always this feeling that Amanda was somehow ahead of me, like she was running a race I didn't even know I had entered. She had graduated law school with honors, landed a position at one of those firms you only read about in glossy magazines, and now she was marrying Richard Thompson, the man with the money, the power, the name that carried weight in every room. That night, after I tucked the kids in and the house went quiet, I sat in bed staring at the invitation, the gold letters shimmering in the lamplight. I thought about how Amanda always seemed to land on her feet, how her life unfolded like a movie, while mine felt more like a routine rerun on cable. My chest felt tight, not just from envy, but from the exhaustion of trying to keep up with a version of myself I never became. Stephen came out of the shower, towel around his shoulders, hair damp and curling at the ends. He noticed the way I was staring at the card and asked what was on my mind. I tried to laugh it off, but finally I admitted the truth. It was Amanda again. It was always Amanda. Everything seemed to fall into place for her. He reached for my hand, warm and solid, and told me I had a good life, that I should stop comparing. He listed it all out. The job, the kids, the home we'd built together, and him, standing there with that half-smile he used when he wanted to lighten the mood. And I nodded, I smiled back, But the knot in my chest didn't unravel. Deep down, I felt like there was something missing, something I couldn't name yet. Stephen gave me that playful wink as he said, "Work, kids, me, what else could you possibly need?" I forced a smile, but inside my chest it felt heavy, like a knot I couldn't loosen, no matter how hard I tried. I told myself I was just tired, that it was nothing more than the weight of too many shifts at the hospital and too little sleep. But the truth sat there, pressing down, quiet and stubborn. The next morning I dialed Amanda's number, the gold invitation still lying on the kitchen counter like it wanted to be noticed. I put on my brightest voice and told her congratulations, and she squealed into the phone with so much joy it almost rang in my ears. She said she could hardly believe it herself, that Richard was her dream come true, and before I could even respond, she asked if I'd help her with the wedding. "We're sisters," she said. And there was this weight in those words, like saying no would have made me the villain of the story. I hesitated for a beat, then said yes. What else could I have said? When I hung up, I stood in the kitchen with my hand still on the phone, feeling a swirl of emotions I couldn't quite name. I wanted to be happy for her, I really did, but there was something in her voice, something a little too triumphant, that scratched at an old wound. I looked over at Stephen's coffee mug, still sitting in the sink from the night before, and thought about the 15 years we'd been together. We had married for love, no doubt about it. Those first years had been passionate, wild even, and then the kids came along. Joshua's colicky nights, Chloe's endless questions, the bills piling higher than our paychecks. Slowly, our love turned into schedules and chores, into tired kisses at the end of the day. I kept telling myself it was fine, that all marriages settle into routine, but sometimes at night I lay awake wondering where that spark had gone. The following day, Amanda and I met for lunch at a little cafe downtown, one of those places with whitewashed walls, plants and hanging pots, and lattes that come with fancy swirls of foam. She looked like she was glowing from the inside out, every movement light, every laugh easy. I swear people turned their heads just to watch her as she walked in. She told me all about how Richard had proposed on a rooftop with fairy lights strung around, the city skyline sparkling behind him. Her words tumbled out in a rush, like she couldn't hold them in, and I sat across from her smiling, sipping my coffee, pretending the knot in my chest wasn't tightening with every detail. Amanda sat across from me, swirling her straw through a glass of iced tea as she told me how she'd met Richard, how he'd swept her off her feet, how he'd gotten down on one knee on the rooftop of some high-end restaurant in Manhattan, with the whole city glittering behind him. She described it like it was straight out of a movie, and I smiled and nodded, but inside I felt that twist again, that sharp little sting of envy I never liked to admit was there. I loved my sister, but she'd always been the one people looked at, the one with the glow, the one who seemed destined for more. And then, in the middle of all her joy, she leaned forward, her eyes locking on mine in this almost vulnerable way, and she said softly, "Karen, I've always wanted to be like you." I almost dropped my fork. She told me I had the perfect family, that Mom and Dad had always been proud of me, that she envied the life I'd built. For a second, I couldn't even breathe. Me? The one sitting there in my cheap department store blouse, juggling 12-hour shifts, bills, and PTA meetings. She had the law degree, the career, the man everyone admired, and she envied me? I muttered something about her being more successful, but she just shook her head and smiled, saying, sure, at work maybe, but I had the house, the kids, and Stephen. That's what she dreamed of. Her words landed heavy, both comforting and unsettling. I had spent my whole life comparing myself to her, and now she was confessing she compared herself to me. It was strange, almost sweet, but it left me with this nagging unease I couldn't shake. That night, when Stephen slipped out to take yet another phone call in the hallway, I caught myself watching the closed door with suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. He came back smiling like always, said it was work, said not to worry, but something in the way he avoided my eyes made my stomach tighten. Was my perfect family really so perfect? The weeks that followed blurred into a storm of responsibilities. Between double shifts at the hospital, helping Chloe with her science project, keeping Joshua's endless energy in check, and diving headfirst into Amanda's wedding prep, meeting florists, tasting cakes, picking out chair covers and color palettes, I felt myself stretched thinner and thinner. Amanda called me nearly every day, sometimes bubbling with excitement about the dress or the honeymoon, other times sounding frantic about centerpieces or the seating chart. I did my best to be patient, to be helpful, but by the end of each day, my body felt like it was made of lead. One night, after I'd tucked Joshua into bed, he pulled at my hand and whispered something that stopped me cold. "Mom, I don't like Uncle Richard." I kissed his forehead, tried to brush it off, but he looked at me with this seriousness that didn't belong on a 7-year-old's face. He said Richard always hid his phone whenever he was around, like he didn't want anyone to see what he was doing, like it was something bad. I laughed it off, told him businessmen are always busy, always glued to their phones, but inside, a flicker of unease stirred, one I tried hard to push away. Joshua frowned, but kept quiet, and I brushed it off as a child's imagination, the way mothers sometimes do when they don't want to face what might be real. But that same evening, when I walked into the living room, I caught Stephen quickly locking his phone and setting it aside like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. My heart skipped, but I tried to keep my voice steady when I asked who he'd been talking to. He gave me that too casual shrug, said it was work, said a project was behind schedule, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes. I nodded, told myself not to read into it, but deep down I knew things had shifted. Lately he was gone more often, late nights at the office, mysterious weekend meetings. I kept telling myself it was the stress of Amanda's wedding, that everyone was stretched thin, that he was just tired. I repeated it to myself like a mantra because the alternative was too heavy to carry. I needed to believe my family was strong, even if the ground beneath us was starting to crack. The night before the wedding, I was at the Grand Oak Hotel, running around like a coordinator instead of just the maid of honor. I had just finished checking the table settings in the ballroom when I spotted Joshua outside in the parking lot. My heart nearly stopped. He was crouched by Richard's shiny black SUV, peeking through the windows like a little detective. I rushed over, my voice sharper than I meant it to be, scolding him that he had no business near someone else's car. He jumped, wide-eyed, like he'd been caught sneaking cookies. "Mom, I was just—" He stammered, kicking a pebble across the pavement, his little shoulders tightening. I narrowed my eyes, asked what he'd been looking at, but he clammed up, muttered, "Nothing," in that stubborn way kids do when they're holding back. I wanted to push, to demand answers, but I could see the way his face pinched, and I didn't want to scare him. So I sighed, told him it was time to head up to the room, reminded him the rehearsal dinner was starting soon. As we walked back inside, his small hand in mine, I couldn't shake the unease curling in my stomach. He wasn't a sneaky kid by nature, and the way he'd been watching both Richard and Stephen lately, it gnawed at me. But I told myself again and again, tomorrow was Amanda's wedding. I needed to keep everything calm, keep the family image together. There'd be time to worry later. At least that's what I told myself then. At the rehearsal dinner that night, everything looked perfect on the surface. The hall glowed with soft lights, glasses clinked, relatives laughed too loudly, and Amanda floated around the room like a queen, her smile as polished as the diamond on her finger. I did my best to join in, raising my glass, nodding at the jokes, but my eyes kept drifting back to Stephen. He checked his phone over and over, like he was waiting for something. At one point, he slipped out into the hallway, and when he finally returned, I leaned toward him and whispered if everything was okay. He brushed it off, said it was just some little issue at work, nothing big, but then added he'd have to run out later, maybe for a couple of hours. I couldn't hide my irritation when I asked if it really had to be tonight of all nights. Tomorrow was Amanda's wedding, the day we'd all been building toward for months. He gave me that half-apologetic smile, kissed my cheek, and promised he'd be back soon. I nodded, because what else could I do? But inside, disappointment burned. I was used to his emergencies, used to being the one who held everything together while he vanished into the night. Still, something in his tone that evening felt different, off in a way I couldn't quite name. Back upstairs in the hotel room, Chloe sat cross-legged on the bed, tapping away on her tablet, lost in her own little world. Joshua was quiet, too quiet, sitting with his knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them. I sat down beside him and asked gently what was wrong. He kept his eyes on the floor and asked when his dad was coming back. I stroked his hair and told him soon, after work, that tomorrow was a big day and we all needed to rest. He was quiet for a long moment, and then, in that small but serious voice only kids have when they know more than they should, he asked, "Mom, is Uncle Richard a good man?" The question stopped me cold. I looked at him, surprised, and managed to say, "Of course, why would you ask that?" He hesitated, shuffled a little, then muttered, "Just wondering," before clamming up. My instinct was to push, to make him tell me what was on his mind, but his little shoulders were already hunched, and I didn't want to make him retreat further. So I kissed the top of his head, told him not to worry, and tucked him under the covers. But later, lying awake in the dark while the kids slept, my husband still gone, I couldn't shake the echo of his question. Why would a 7-year-old ask me that unless he had seen something he couldn't quite explain? My stomach twisted as I stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in years, I felt a real crack run through the picture of our so-called perfect family. "Never mind," Joshua mumbled, pulling the blanket over his shoulders. I kissed the top of his head, told him not to make things up, and urged him to brush his teeth and get some sleep. Soon both kids were breathing steady in their beds, but Stephen still hadn't come back. I called his phone a few times, each time landing on voicemail, his recorded voice sounding colder than I remembered. It was close to midnight when the door finally creaked open. My heart jumped, but then I saw him, Stephen, shoulders slumped, rubbing the back of his neck like he'd been carrying the world on it. "Sorry, Karen," he muttered, eyes down. "It was a mess, took longer than I thought." He looked tired, yes, but behind the exhaustion there was something else. Something like unease, a shadow flickering in his eyes before he quickly looked away. I asked if everything was okay. He gave a quick nod, said the problem at work was resolved, and tossed his tie onto the chair. When he noticed I was still awake, he frowned. "Why aren't you sleeping?" he asked. I told him the truth. I was waiting for him. He kissed my forehead and told me to rest, but the knot in my chest only grew tighter. I lay awake long after he drifted off, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, wondering why my instincts wouldn't quiet down. The next morning, the whole hotel was buzzing like a beehive. Florists rushed through the halls with armfuls of roses, waiters polished glassware until it sparkled, and Amanda's laughter carried from her suite like music. I slipped into my bridesmaid dress, smoothed my hair in the mirror, and forced a smile onto my face. Whatever storm was brewing inside me had to wait. Today wasn't about me. Amanda stood in the middle of her room like a vision, her white gown glowing in the morning light, her eyes bright and full of joy. "I can't believe this day is really here," she said, her voice trembling with happiness as she gazed out the window at the gardens below. Then she turned to me, her face softening, and whispered, "Karen, thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." I wrapped my arms around her, breathing in the scent of her perfume, trying to swallow the mix of love, pride, and that familiar ache of envy. She was radiant, and I was determined not to let my own shadows touch her glow. At least not yet. "If you're happy, that's all that matters," I told Amanda, pulling her close and holding on to her warmth for a moment, as if that hug could steady me. The ceremony unfolded like something out of a glossy magazine, flowers draped just right, music swelling in perfect time, guests leaning toward each other with tears in their eyes. From the outside, it was flawless. But inside me, there was a restless drumbeat I couldn't quiet. Every time I glanced at Stephen, I saw his gaze land on Amanda, and once, clear as day, I watched him wink at her. I told myself it was harmless, just a gesture between family, but my chest tightened with every denial, because deep down I already knew it was something else. Joshua, of all people, made it harder to pretend. He was never the kind of kid to sit still with a phone in his hand, yet there he was at the front row, holding it up with this seriousness that made him look older than 7. I tried to catch his eye, to signal for him to put it away, but he only looked back at me with a stubborn steadiness, like he was guarding something more important than the ceremony itself. I shifted in my chair, forcing myself to face forward, but unease curled deeper into me. By the time we moved into the reception hall, laughter and music filled the air so thickly it almost drowned me. I raised my glass when others did. I smiled when a camera swung my way, but my eyes never stopped searching. That's when I saw Amanda slip out into the hallway, her gown trailing behind her, catching the soft light. I thought maybe she needed help, that the dress was too heavy or the bustle too tricky, and I followed without a second thought. What I found instead stopped me cold. Stephen was waiting. He stood just outside the bathroom doors like he belonged there, his face lighting up when Amanda appeared. She walked toward him, and in that moment, everything around them blurred. He touched her hand lightly, leaned in close, and whispered something against the hum of the air vents. Their faces, their body language, the ease between them. It was intimacy, plain and sharp, and it sliced through me in an instant. I froze behind a marble column, the blood rushing so hard in my ears I could barely hear their words. My chest pounded, my stomach twisted, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then, with legs that felt like they didn't belong to me, I turned back toward the ballroom. I smiled at relatives, laughed at jokes I didn't hear, raised my glass to toasts that sounded like static. Every swallow of wine was bitter, every laugh hollow. My eyes betrayed me, darting again and again to where Stephen and Amanda sat, too careful not to sit too close, and yet every movement between them was threaded with the truth. My insides boiled, but it was her wedding day, and if I tore the veil off in that moment, I wouldn't just be burning myself, I'd be burning everyone in the room. So I kept the mask on, even as it cut into me. I noticed Joshua sitting off to the side, his little fingers twisting around my phone like it was burning him. His face looked nothing like a child's in that moment, his brow drawn tight, his mouth pressed in a straight line, his eyes carrying something far too heavy. I slipped into the chair beside him, leaning close, trying to sound calm even though my heart was still racing from what I'd seen in the hallway. I asked what was wrong, and he looked straight at me with those wide, frightened eyes and whispered, "Mom, we need to leave, right now." He grabbed my hand like he was trying to pull me away before I even understood what he meant. I forced myself to keep my voice steady, told him to explain, and that's when he pushed the phone into my palm. On the screen was a photo I didn't want to see, Stephen and Amanda, standing in one of the hotel corridors, their fingers laced together. My stomach lurched as I scanned the corner of the screen and saw the date. Yesterday. My throat tightened, but I swiped again, and there were more pictures, each one worse than the last. The two of them wrapped in an embrace, sitting in his car, her head resting on his shoulder. Each image was a blow, stripping away the last of my denial. Then came the message thread, and Joshua's small voice trembled as he explained he had been on the tablet, that a notification had popped up from Stephen's phone. He opened it by accident and found a string of messages between his dad and Amanda. My chest burned as I read them. Casual, intimate words woven with secrecy. "Meet me tonight. Told Richard I had a meeting." My vision blurred, the letters swimming as if they knew they carried the truth I wasn't ready to face. I started to scold him, to tell him he shouldn't have been looking, but the words caught in my throat when I saw the tears brimming in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I knew Dad was doing something bad, and Uncle Richard, I feel bad for him." My heart cracked at the weight he carried, a weight no 7-year-old should know. I pulled him into my arms, pressing my face into his hair, fighting the lump rising in my throat. I told him he wasn't to blame, that I was grateful he showed me, even as I tried not to break in front of him. I scrolled through the messages again, my hands shaking so hard I could barely keep the screen steady. It wasn't some fleeting mistake, not some reckless kiss in a weak moment. This was a full-blown affair that had lasted years, lies layered on lies, secrets hidden in plain sight, and here it was, unraveling on the very day my sister was supposed to begin her happily ever after. 15 years of marriage, 2 children, the trust I had poured myself into, it all came crashing down in that dimly lit ballroom. And Amanda, my sister, the one I thought I could count on more than anyone else in the world, had been the one holding the knife. All around me the reception carried on as if nothing had cracked open, glasses clinking, relatives laughing, the band spilling out cheerful music that felt cruel against the storm in my chest. I looked at Joshua, his small hand gripping mine so tightly it almost hurt, his courage breaking my heart in ways I couldn't put into words. He shouldn't have had to carry this, but he did. And because of him, I couldn't hide any longer. I leaned close and whispered that we weren't leaving, not yet. His eyes widened, afraid I was about to cause a scene, but I told him the truth had to come out, that Richard deserved to know, and that sometimes being an adult meant facing things head-on. He searched my face, like he wanted to be sure I meant it, and I nodded, brushing the tears off my cheeks before they gave me away. His little shoulders squared in a way that reminded me of Stephen when we first married. Only Joshua's strength felt cleaner, braver. We found Richard in the far corner of the ballroom, surrounded by colleagues in their suits, his laugh booming over the music, as if he hadn't just been made a fool. The moment he caught sight of me, though, his smile faltered. Something in my expression must have told him this wasn't small talk. He excused himself and came over, his brow furrowed. "Karen, is something wrong?" he asked, his voice low, already bracing for an answer he didn't want. I tightened my hold on Joshua's shoulder, steadying both of us, and told Richard we needed to step outside. He followed without protest, though his jaw clenched as if he already suspected. The cool night air hit us the second we pushed through the glass doors, the sound of music and laughter fading behind us, replaced by the rustle of leaves in the hotel garden. For a moment I just breathed, the chill biting at my skin, trying to summon the strength to break a man's world apart on the very night he thought it was beginning. Finally, I met his eyes. "This isn't easy, but you have to know," I said, my voice shaking as I handed him the phone. Joshua found something. His hands trembled as he took it, the glow of the screen lighting up his face as he scrolled through picture after picture, message after message. I watched the disbelief fade into realization, then sink into something darker, pain, betrayal, the quiet breaking of a man who had given his trust to the wrong person. I handed Richard the phone, and I'll never forget the way his face changed as he scrolled. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally the kind of pain that sinks deep, the kind you can't hide. His lips parted, but no words came out until his voice cracked, raw and low, asking me how long it had been going on. My throat tightened, but I told him the only truth I didn't know. Joshua had stumbled across it by accident. He just wanted to do the right thing. Richard's hands trembled as he gave the phone back. For a moment he just stared at the ground, his shoulders heavy with a weight I knew too well. Then, barely above a whisper, he admitted he had suspected. He'd noticed the deleted messages, the sudden meetings, the excuses that never quite added up, but he hadn't wanted to believe it, not from Amanda. He looked at Joshua then and somehow found the strength to smile faintly, telling my little boy he was brave. My heart ached at the sight, Richard unraveling, my son standing taller than his years, all of us caught in a truth too heavy for the night air. That was when the doors swung open and Amanda appeared, Stephen just a step behind her. She stopped short when she saw us together in the garden, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Her voice wavered as she asked what we were doing out there. Stephen froze, his gaze darting to the phone in Richard's hand, his face paling with recognition. Amanda moved closer, trying to sound firm but already faltering, demanding to know what was being said. Richard lifted his hand, stopping her in her tracks, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. He told her the truth was out, that he never imagined learning about her and Stephen on the very night they were supposed to be celebrating their marriage. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might collapse. She stammered something about a misunderstanding, clinging to denial as if it could undo what we all knew. Stephen stepped forward then, his tone defensive, almost pleading. He insisted it wasn't what it looked like, that they had only been discussing work, and that was the moment I felt something inside me snap. My hands shook, my heart pounded, but my voice cut through the night, trembling yet firm. I told him enough, told them both enough. 15 years of marriage, 2 children, all of it shattered. And as I said the words, I realized there was no taking them back, no repairing what had already been broken beyond recognition. 15 years of marriage, 2 children, trust, I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to slice through the night. You destroyed everything. Amanda reached out, desperate to grab the phone from Richard's hands, but he pulled back and kept scrolling, his face hardening with every word he read. Then he lifted his voice, reading aloud one of Stephen's messages. Meet me tonight. Told Richard I had a meeting. The words hung between us like a blade. This is your idea of work? He asked, his voice heavy with disgust. Silence fell thick, the kind that makes it hard to breathe. Joshua's small hand squeezed mine so tightly I thought he might break my fingers, grounding me when my knees threatened to buckle. Amanda's composure shattered. She burst into sobs, her makeup streaking down her cheeks. It's not what it looks like, she cried, her voice breaking. Richard's jaw tightened, and before I could speak, he cut her off, demanding, Then what is it? I turned on her, rage and heartbreak spilling out. Why my husband? Why betray your own sister? And that's when her grief twisted into something uglier. Her tears turned to fire and she snapped back at me, yelling that I'd always been the better one, that our parents had adored me, that I had the perfect home, the perfect children, the kind of life she could never measure up to. I lived in your shadow, she spat, her voice trembling with fury. Stephen understood me. He saw me. A laugh tore out of me, sharp and bitter, so unlike any laugh I'd ever known. The cruelest joke of all, me envying her shine, while she envied my supposed stability. 2 sisters devouring each other's lives from the inside out. But envy doesn't excuse betrayal. Nothing does. Richard's voice cut through, colder than ice. He told her the wedding was over, that he would face the guests himself, apologize for the farce, and make sure everyone knew he wouldn't build a life on lies. His words were steady, final, and for the first time all night Amanda had nothing left to say. Stephen tried then, his voice reaching for me, saying my name as if it could pull me back, as if it could erase what I'd seen. But I lifted a hand and stopped him. Enough, I told him, my voice quiet but resolute. Our marriage is finished. For the sake of the children, leave quietly. Tonight. Joshua's grip on my hand trembled, and when I looked down at him, his eyes were full of tears that mirrored my own. I turned away, my body heavy, but my decision clear, and led my son back toward the hotel where Chloe was waiting. Behind me, their voices carried in fragments, pleas, excuses, the ruin of what they'd chosen. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because for me, there was no going back. Come on, let's get Chloe and go home, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I turned to Amanda one last time, my chest tight with fury and grief, and told her what I knew to be true, that real family stands by you. It doesn't stab you in the back. You made your choice, I said. Stay out of my life. And with that, I walked away without looking back. Behind me, I could hear Richard's voice, sharp and controlled as he confronted her, but I didn't listen. I couldn't. My world had collapsed in the span of an evening, and yet the truth my son had brought into the light steadied me like nothing else could. I pulled Joshua close, kissed the top of his head, and together we walked down the long corridor toward our room, where Chloe was waiting, unaware of how much her world had shifted while she played on her tablet. Later that night, back in our own kitchen, I tucked both kids into bed and sat alone with the silence. The wedding ring on my finger gleamed under the dim light, mocking me with memories of promises that had turned into lies. 15 years, 2 children, all the trust I had poured into that marriage, broken. I pressed my palms against my face, but even through the tears, I felt something else rising: resolve. Joshua had been braver than I ever imagined, and because of him, I couldn't cling to illusions anymore. Truth mattered more than comfort, even if it shattered us. The months that followed were a blur of lawyers, custody schedules, and endless conversations with the kids. By the time the divorce papers were signed, I was exhausted but unbroken. 6 months after that night, I stood in front of a modest ranch-style house on the edge of town, unloading cardboard boxes from the trunk of my car. The place was small, but it had a yard where Joshua was already talking about planting apple trees, and Chloe was imagining where her bookshelves would go. "Grab your bags," I called, forcing cheer into my voice, and they came running, backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, their laughter carrying more hope than I thought possible. Stephen still saw them on weekends, and they missed him in their own ways, but we were finding our rhythm. I had started a new job as a family counselor, channeling my own pain into something useful, helping others rebuild the way I was learning to. The work gave me purpose, the kids gave me strength, and slowly, piece by piece, our lives began to take shape again. We were bruised, yes, but we were standing, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground under my feet was truly my own. One afternoon, Chloe looked up from her drawing and said quietly, "Dad says he loves us, but if he loves us, why did he do what he did?" Her words pierced me deeper than she knew, but I forced my voice to stay gentle. I told her, again, what I'd been repeating for months, that sometimes adults make choices that hurt people, but those mistakes aren't children's to carry. They weren't to blame, and neither was she. I could see she wanted to believe me, but a shadow lingered in her eyes that broke my heart. A few days later, on a crisp morning when the kids were at school, I heard the doorbell ring. When I opened it, there was Richard standing awkwardly on my porch, holding a potted violet like it was a peace offering. "Housewarming," he said, his smile small but sincere. "It grows like new life." I stepped aside and let him in, and as he set the plant on the kitchen counter, I felt something shift in the air. Lighter, calmer, two people who had both been broken in different ways and were slowly learning how to stitch themselves back together. After the disaster of the wedding, I hadn't expected us to stay in touch, but grief makes strange companions. One day, he asked me to meet for coffee, just to talk, and it became a quiet ritual. Two people unburdening truths over steaming mugs, finding solace in the simple fact that we weren't alone in our pain. Sitting in my living room now, he thanked me again for telling him the truth that night. "It hurt like hell," he admitted, "but it was better than living blind." His voice carried both weight and relief. I nodded, because I understood all too well. Joshua wandered in, curious, and Richard smiled at him with real warmth. "You've got a brave son," he told me. He saw the truth and wasn't afraid to show it. My chest swelled with pride and sadness all at once. Joshua had grown up too quickly, forced to carry secrets no child should, but he was resilient, steady in a way that gave me hope. Over time, I learned that Amanda and Stephen had imploded soon after that night. Their affair hadn't survived the very fire it sparked. She left town for a new job in another city, and he slid into the arms of someone else not long after. But that was no longer my story to follow. I stopped keeping tabs on him because my life had narrowed to what truly mattered: my children and the fragile, steady path I was carving for us. As the year turned and Christmas lights began to glow on porches around Maplewood, I found myself stringing garlands with Chloe and Joshua in our small new house. We were laughing, tape sticking to our fingers, the scent of cookies baking in the oven. For the first time in so long, joy didn't feel like something borrowed or forced. It felt like ours, tender and real, rising from the rubble of what we had lost. Joshua was standing on a chair, carefully hanging a string of lights, his tongue poking out in concentration, while Chloe sat cross-legged at the table, sketching Christmas cards in colored pencil. The house smelled of gingerbread and pine, the kind of scent that makes you believe for a moment that everything broken can be made whole again. And then the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, opened the door, and froze. Amanda stood there, thinner than I'd ever seen her, her eyes hollow and ringed with exhaustion. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she asked if we could talk. She told me she had ended things with Stephen, that it had all been a mistake. For a moment, I just stared, the past rushing in so hard it pressed against my ribs. My instinct was to shut the door, to guard what I had left. But then I thought of Joshua and Chloe, of the joy in their faces that night, and I stepped back. "It's New Year's Eve," I said quietly. "Come in." She walked inside hesitantly, glancing around like she wasn't sure she belonged. Joshua stopped mid-stride when he saw her, his hand frozen in the air, but then he lifted it and gave her a small wave. "Happy New Year, Aunt Amanda," he said softly. Chloe smiled shyly from the table. Amanda's eyes filled, but she managed a weak smile back at them. I watched the exchange from the doorway, my heart a tangle of feelings I couldn't quite name. I didn't feel rage anymore, but I didn't feel warmth either. Whatever forgiveness might someday come was still far away. Yet for the sake of my children, for the fragile hope we were building together, I let her sit with us by the tree. We shared the glow of the lights, the quiet shuffle of wrapping paper, the sound of my kids' laughter filling the room like a balm. And as I sat there, I realized that family isn't just blood. It's trust, it's honesty, and sometimes, against all odds, it's the willingness to try again. Joshua had shown me that truth matters more than illusion, that even painful honesty can be a gift. The road to healing would be long, I knew that, but in that moment we had taken the first step. I watched the lights reflecting in their young faces, felt the steady rhythm of my own breathing, and understood something simple but profound. We were going to be okay, because we had chosen truth over lies, and that choice would carry us forward into whatever came next. If any part of this touched you, if you've ever felt betrayal, or strength, or that spark of starting over, drop a comment below and tell me what part hit you the most. I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. It's the best way to let me know you want to hear more stories like this one, raw and real, straight from the soul.